the notebook a lot for my data science project in Python, but nowadays I find it easier to use Jupyter Notebook inside Visual Studio Code, as I can easily use GitHub Copilot, which we'll talk about later in this video. Once you decide which tool to use, you can immediately start learning the basics, like variables, data types, and functions. You really want to know the basics of control flows like conditional statements and loops. Don't get carried away. A lot of times we get stuck in the details of some small topics and lose motivation, and we want to avoid that. To help you visualize what you may want to learn at each stage of learning Python, I decided to create this mind map for learning Python. If you laid out every single Python concept in a mind map, this is basically what it will look like. You can see on this mind map, I divide the topics into basic, intermediate, and advanced. As you can imagine, the basic topics include the integrated development environment for Python, how to install and manage packages, working directory, and all things basic, just in any programming languages such as data types, variables, functions, operators, conditional statements, and loop statements. It's fine not to completely understand everything at this stage. You have the chance to practice and solidify your knowledge in the next levels. Moving on to the intermediate topics, where you can start doing really useful things. On this level, you should learn more advanced things like working with different types of files, version control with Git, Python for data science, aka doing data analysis and machine learning with Python, object-oriented programming, decorators, debugging, and error handling. At this stage, you also want to pay attention to good coding practices, meaning writing clean, readable, and efficient code. There's a distinction between writing code for a personal toy project and building something in the real world. Some of the most important good coding practices may include: follow the style guide for Python code and be consistent with it. Use meaningful variable names. Trust me, naming variables is one of the hardest things in programming. Avoid hard coding numbers in your code because no one would be able to understand what these numbers represent except yourself. Use list comprehensions and generators when necessary instead of using for loops. Also add error handling in your code. Provide commenting and documentation in your code. Use virtual environments to encapsulate packages for separate projects. If necessary, you also want to create unit tests for your functions. At this stage, there could be a lot of things to learn, so I'd recommend you start thinking about what you want to focus on. For example, if you are learning Python for data science, machine learning, and AI, you know that you need to master all the basics, plus some of the most basic Python packages you need to use for working with data, such as NumPy, Pandas, Matplotlib, Seaborn, and Scikit-learn. While if you want to learn to become a data engineer or software engineer, then object-oriented programming, decorators, and learn to write efficient and clean code are even more important. Once you've moved on to the more advanced topics, you can start building more complex applications, and you can start learning how to use an API for your application, develop a web application with a user interface or a complex game, and so on. This is also where you start moving from building prototypes in Jupyter Notebooks to building an user-friendly application. In Python, there are a lot of popular frameworks that make it easier for you to develop a web app, for example, Django and Flask. You also learn how to deploy your application on a cloud hosting platform. If you want to learn advanced programming and develop complex applications, I'd like to shout out to Code Crafters, who has kindly sponsored this video. Code Crafters is a learning platform to help engineers get really good at their craft. Build your own Redis, Git, Docker, SQLite from scratch just for fun. They also have a separate Python track where you can learn to use Python to create your own software. This platform targets senior programmers who want to build tools and master their skills. If this sounds interesting to you, check out Code Crafters in the description below. Alright, you can use this mind map as a useful reference for knowing what is what in Python and building your own learning curriculum based on your goals and your needs. After that, you can start looking up some tutorials on YouTube or signing up for an online Python course and go through the concepts you want to learn. I've also linked this mind map in the video description below, so feel free to check it out and explore it. This overview is just a guidance. The best way to actually learn something though is through doing, and the best way to actually own your knowledge is through teaching. Let me explain. Most of us learn like this. You learn something and then move on to the next thing and then move on to the next thing. By the time you move on to the fourth or the fifth thing, you already forget the previous things you learned. Sounds familiar? This is not because you're stupid. It is because if you learn something without immediately applying it, your brain would get a signal saying, oh, this thing is apparently not important because I never need to use it for anything. So a better way to learn Python or any foreign languages is to immediately put what you've learned into practice and start creating something useful with it. This something doesn't need to be too useful. For example, you just learn about Python functions. You can create a function to calculate your BMI. If you need some ideas, you can simply go to ChatGPT and ask it to create a quiz or practice problem for you. At this point, you might think, okay, cool, I can move on to the next thing. Or you might decide to go to the next level, which is to teach others what you've learned. I love writing blog posts and tutorials or making videos to explain concepts I just learned.